All right, so as we folks gather, let me take a few minutes to say a few things. And first of all, welcome to everybody here from across the country. We're so pleased to have you here on Indigenous Peoples Day. We selected doing an event today, 10 months ago, because of the importance of this day. And we're so pleased to have Brian join us. He is the perfect speaker to be speaking about that. Well, he just writes a lot about very related topics. So we're looking forward to that. There'll be a Q&A at the end. And the way that's going to work is we're going to ask you to put questions in the chat as Brian is going. And then at the end, Doug Wysocki Johnson, who is our executive director, and Brian will have a conversation, and that will be based on the questions that you're putting in the chat. So just put them in as you go, as we're going along, and we'll be monitoring them. I'll mention after this event in the coming weeks, we're going to do a follow-on events about the book, kind of a book club, so that we can have more dialogue about that. So if you're interested, there's you can go to the Lumunos events webpage, which Becca, one of our other folks from Lumunos, will be putting into the chat at some point, or you just go to the website and you can see about how to sign up for that and be part of it. And also feel free to just shoot us an email and we can tell you about that. So a bit about Lumunos. Lumunos is a small but mighty organization. We've got a long history, about 100 years now. We were started by Reverend Sam Shoemaker, who was a pivotal voice in the 12 Steps. He may have been the sole author of the 12 Steps, but no one's quite sure. But if he wasn't the sole author, he was a hugely important author, and also was one of the reasons with Bill W. Kind of started the AA conversations before AA became AA. So we have that long history. Now, at that time it was called Faith at Work. We're now called Lumunos. Our mission these days is to help people live fuller, more authentic lives as they align their life's choices and relationships with their sacred values. So we're all about helping people to find their calling, big or small, and also to talk about the power of having a calling. A few words about Brian. Brian is an author, speaker, an activist, a former pastor, a former English teacher. You may have seen him or heard him on things like On Being, CNN. He has New York Times. He is widely known across the planet. And he's a passionate advocate for a new kind of Christianity, which he defines as just, generous, and working with people of all faiths for the common good. I've had the good fortune the past couple of years to be around Brian in some different venues as a student at the Living School, which is where I met Brian. Brian is now on the faculty there, and I just love being in his presence. He says wise things in a way that even I can understand, and they stick with me. He has said things, and I've said this to him, that have literally been life-changing for me. He's super curious about things, not just around spiritual and theological things, but science, literature, the arts, history. And if you've read his books, and as you're here tonight, that knowledge of the world permeates how he thinks and what he writes about. He's also, when you're with him, and maybe I think that'll get conveyed a little bit here in Zoom. He's just he's very present when you talk with him, and he's kind and generous, and he really listens to you and is a fountain of wise advice. So I wasn't quite sure. I wanted to read a little something, and I didn't want to take it from the book because I wasn't quite sure where Brian was going to go tonight. So I'm going to take a little something from another one of his books. It's about the Galapagos Islands, and it's called The Galapagos Islands, A Spiritual Journey. Tonight, if you look up, you'll see the moon, maybe Venus, maybe Orion, reminding that you're riding the wave that began with the Big Bang 13.7 billion years ago. If you make it your habit to slow down for just a half a minute between your front door and your car, or between your office and the subway, and you look up and take a few deep breaths and see with those amazing eyes that you have, who knows what wisdom might dawn upon you during that intentional mini vacation. So I'm going to invite all of you to sit back and enjoy the mini vacation we're about to go on with Brian McLaren, and I'll turn it over to him now.
Thank you very much, Dan. Great to be with all of you. I just want to tell you two things before I get started. First, I was a little nervous about whether I was going to be able to be here with you all because I live where we had an unexpected visitor from where I live named Ian just over a week ago. And there was so much destruction. I wondered if we'd have electricity in time for this. But it turns out that I had a speaking engagement in Utah, and now I'm in a very nice hotel, Marriott hotel, but I'm a little nervous about the glitchy internet. So if there's any trouble with internet, we've got a couple backup plans. So I don't want any of you to feel nervous about that if that happens. I hope it won't. And then the second thing I wanted to say just is that I'm so glad to be hanging out with Dan. We were just in Ireland together as part of a pilgrimage there, had a lovely time. And I'm glad to be with Doug Wysocki Johnson again and have this connection with Lumunos. What a wonderful organization. And we'll actually circle back to some connections between Lumunos and what I'd like to share today. I'm going to share slides as we go along. And let me just make sure I press the right button here. And let me now make sure I press play. And can you all see those slides? If so, give me a thumbs up. Does that come through okay? Great. I am, among other things, a lover of nature and the outdoors and birds. I started noticing birds when I was probably a junior high school student. The first bird I ever was curious about, I saw singing on the telephone line in front of my house, and I went and looked it up and found out it was called a house finch, very common bird. It had been there all through my life, but I had never noticed it before. And one of my favorite birds in the world, I get to see where I live now in Southwest Florida. It's this amazing bird called the swallow-tailed kite. If you ever see one, you'll never forget it. So graceful, the way they almost can hover and do so much acrobatics without ever flapping a wing. That little forked tail just allows them to make all kinds of amazing moves in the air. They even catch bugs in the air and eat them while they're flying. And usually it happens in late July, early August where I live. You'll see an aggregation of swallow-tailed kites. It's just unforgettable. They aggregate and then migrate en masse from Florida to where they spend the winter. They're a little bit unlike snowbirds who spend the winter in Florida and the summer somewhere up north. These guys spend the summer in Florida, and then these are some migratory paths of different swallow-tailed kites. They end up down in Brazil or Uruguay or northern Argentina. It's an amazing migration when you think about it, especially when they fly across the Gulf of Mexico in one shot. And of course, birds aren't the only creatures who migrate. We know about the migration of salmon. It's just so amazing. And all of us, I'm sure, when we notice a monarch butterfly, we know about their amazing migration patterns. And probably we also know that they're threatened because people didn't like milkweed. So we've used herbicide on milkweed in millions of acres of land and left them with nothing to eat and no place to lay their eggs because their caterpillars can only eat milkweed. But they have this amazing migration from Canada all the way down to Mexico. It's kind of amazing to think a little insect can do that. You maybe never thought of it before, but we human beings have been on a long migration too. The numbers keep being adjusted when we get new anthropological insights, but somewhere around 230,000 years ago, every one of us had common ancestors who were living in Africa. And they had a couple of migrations where they would head north. Some of them headed west into Europe, across the Middle East. Some headed north, ending up in Russia. Some of them headed southeast, making it all the way to Australia. And much more recently, again, there's some controversy about how long ago, but some of our ancestors made it to Alaska. And within just a few hundred years, humans had spread from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego across North, Central, and South America. And of course, while we're talking right now, before we're done, the space station will pass overhead, reminding us that human migrations, who knows where they'll go, even in the lifetime of some of us, perhaps on this call, will maybe have human beings who've migrated to the moon or to Mars for more than just a short visit. And this sense that we human beings are on the move, I think is really, really important because very often we get stuck in our minds. We think of ourselves as a finished product, but really we're a relatively young species and we have no idea where our journeys will take us. The idea of human beings being on migration and on the move shouldn't be any surprise to people who are familiar with the Bible. The primary story in the Hebrew scriptures is about a migration, a group of people who were enslaved in Egypt and migrating north to a land where they could be free. And for those of us who are Christians, and I should say there was a later migration when some centuries later, the Israeli people had a forced exile. Kind of today is Indigenous Peoples Day, and it's a day where we remember the forced migrations here on this continent. And this is a story that was familiar to the Jewish people who were placed on a forced migration to Babylon. And then Jesus shows up on the scene, and he's in constant motion. Foxes have holes, birds have nests. The Son of Man doesn't have any place to lay his head. He was just always, always, always on the move. And when you read the rest of the New Testament, Paul shows up, carries on that tradition, and he's having travels all over the Mediterranean world. And this movement, this spiritual movement, started with such a history of adventure and migration and exploration. It's kind of sad and kind of strange and kind of counterintuitive that in many places, the Christian community acts like its best days are in the past and is nostalgic and even regressive in its imagination, especially if we believe that God, the Spirit, the source of everything that exists, creates a world and a universe of living things in motion, and where there is literally nothing standing still. Everything, every quark and muon and gluon and other subatomic particle, everything is in motion. And when we let that sink in, then I think it helps us understand some of the struggle that's going on in spiritual communities. Now, I can speak as a Christian, but I can tell you, because I've been deeply involved in multi-faith friendships and collaborations and work, that very similar conversations are happening in the world's second largest religion, Islam, and across Hinduism and Buddhism and Sikhism and Judaism and all of the other major faith traditions. there are deep discussions about how do we revere our past? How do we honor our past? How do we take seriously our past without letting it become an anchor that keeps us from being able to move freely into the future? I wrote about this in this book, Great Spiritual Migration, and I said, religion is at its best, a force that leads us forward when it guides us in our spiritual growth as individuals and in our cultural evolution as a species. Unfortunately, religion often becomes more of a cage than a guide, a buffer to constructive change rather than a catalyst of it. In times of rapid and ambiguous change, a regressive turn in religion may be understandable, but it is even more tragic. When a culture needs wise spiritual guidance the most, all it gets from religious leaders is a big dose of nostalgia. Today, millions of us, Catholic, evangelical, mainline Protestant, and others, share something that we seldom verbalize. We're worried that the brand of our religion has been so compromised that many of us are barely able to use the label anymore. Our religions often stand for the very opposite of what our founders stood for. And so this sense that we're in a world that's trying to move forward in some places and trying to move backwards in other places and feeling torn in the middle in other places, I think we see reflected in our religious communities too. Some forms of religion leading us forward, some kind of trying to hold the status quo, and others actually interested in moving us backward. And so this image of migration and movement is, to me, very rich and very powerful. In my book, Great Spiritual Migration, I talk about three deeply important migrations that I think are happening and are simultaneously being resisted. The first one is what I would call a spiritual migration. And I'd like to talk come back and I'll talk to you about the other two. Spiritual migration that I've seen happening all of my lifetime, and it began before my lifetime, is a very significant one in the Christian faith. Again, it has counterparts in Judaism, Islam. I think something very similar is brewing in many of our faith traditions. Even non-theistic traditions like Buddhism, I think, have a version of this going on. But here's what I think is at the heart of this deeply spiritual migration. It's moving from understanding religion and spirituality, as moving from understanding them as a system of beliefs to a way of life, which is a way of love. This movement from system of beliefs to way of life. Now, many of you, maybe you've been on this journey your whole lives. Others of you, though, when you hear about this, you say, hold it just a minute. That's what my religion is. It is a system of beliefs. Yeah, it has a way of life, but most essentially what it is a system of beliefs. And all I'd like to suggest to you is that is a belief that you hold about what your religion is. And that belief, many people are questioning. Many people are saying maybe what a religion should be is not simply defined by a set of unchanging beliefs, but rather a trajectory, a journey toward a way of life, which is a way of love. Now, it's a fact I'm quite sure the majority of Christians, whether Catholic, Orthodox, evangelical, many mainline Protestants, would say that Christianity is adherence to a system of beliefs. But I'd like to challenge that somewhat playfully with you for a couple of minutes, just to help everybody imagine, to try to, even if you decide at the end that you disagree with me, you'll be better off for trying to imagine this. You remember when Jesus said, what is the greatest commandment? And he said, you shall have the correct belief system. Not quite, but that's what you would think he said based on the obsession that many of our religious communities have had with systems of belief. Jesus, so interesting, when he was asked that question, what's the one greatest commandment? And in one of the gospel passages, it's very specific. What is the one greatest commandment? And Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Now, if those of you who are students of the Gospels know, this is quite surprising because Jesus almost never answers a question straight. He very often answers a question with a question, or he finds one way or another to tell people they're asking the wrong question. But in this case, it seems like he answers the question. What's the greatest commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then you see that little twinkle in his eye. And he says, and the second is equally important, which I think is his way of saying a couple of things that are very powerful. One of them is that maybe your desire to have one commandment is problematic. Maybe what we need is something a little more nuanced than that. And so when Jesus says the second is equally important, he adds to the love of God the love of neighbor. And for Jesus to say love of God and love of neighbor are inseparable. I mean, when you take that in, I grew up in a Christian family, went to church, youth group, everything else. I don't think I ever had anybody just say it like that. That what Jesus is basically saying, he's saying, if you want to say that you love God, but don't want to love other people, including the outsider, the outcast, the alien, the outlier, and even your enemy, he's saying, sorry, that's not how it works. Something very powerful is happening in what Jesus said there. So he says, the most important thing is not correct beliefs. The most important thing is love. And Paul comes along and in a sense ups the ante. All of you are familiar, if you've ever been to a Christian wedding, with 1 Corinthians 13, a chapter that gets read at almost every Christian wedding. If I speak with the tongues of men and angels, have not love, I'm just a noisy gong, a clanging cymbal. What's so interesting about that love chapter is it's not written for weddings. It's written for life. And what Paul is saying is all of the other things we can be obsessed with, they don't matter. They're just a lot of religious noise if love isn't primary. One of the most provocative statements in the entire biblical library is something Paul says in Galatians. In fact, it's so interesting. We have other verses that people like to memorize and put on billboards. I've never seen this one put on a billboard. It's Jesus that Paul said, the only thing that matters is faith expressing itself in love. Quite a remarkable statement. John picks it up in his epistles and says, if you say you love God and hate your brother, you're a liar. And James says, look, if you want to know what true religion is, it's showing kindness to vulnerable people, widows and orphans. That if you just have faith, but you never translate it into loving action, that faith is worse than comatose. And so this has been a journey in my own life. I spent decades of my life trying to perfect all my beliefs. And love was sort of a nice icing on the cake, but I spent most of my time on the cake, which is correcting my beliefs. And then gradually, it's the most obvious thing in the world started dawning on me that for Jesus and the other sort of pioneers of Christian faith, it was all about love. And then it sort of dawned on me, we have spent billions of dollars and uncountable numbers of human hours, of work hours, fighting about beliefs, arguing about beliefs. I'm not saying beliefs aren't important. I'm just saying they're not the point. And then we've spent very little attention in how do we actually learn to become loving human beings individually? How do we become loving communities of human beings? It's been troubling to me to say that this religion has been around for about 2,000 years, and we still haven't made the main thing our main thing by taking seriously, how do we learn how to love? When I moved to Florida almost 14 years ago, my wife and I started attending a little Episcopal church, and I came in and sat at the back row for 6 months and managed to never meet a single person. After being a pastor for 24 years, it was just fun to sort of switch roles. And when I finally met the priest, he said to me, "Oh, I hear you're a writer." He says, "I don't read much. I have dyslexia." He said, "So I haven't read any of your books. I probably won't." I said, "That's just fine." And then he gave me a great gift. He said, "When you come here to this church, I just want you to be able to relax. We'll minister to you. We're not going to put any pressure on you." That changed. This is that priest. His name is Kyle Bennett. He has since moved on to a new parish. But he called me some years ago and said, "Hey, Brian, remember how I said I never am going to ask anything of you?" He said, "Well, that's about to change." He said, Kyle has a deep commitment to children with disabilities. And if he were here, he would say, they're not children with disabilities, they're children with diverse abilities. And so he started a summer camp for children with diverse abilities. And then that camp has been replicated all over the country. And I got to be part of it when we did it in our city. And it was super moving seeing, he would recruit maybe 75 to 125 counselors for 35 to 50 campers, because many of the campers needed 2 or 3 counselors to care for them, because they weren't mobile or they weren't verbal. And it was just this beautiful experience, taking our little island in Southwest Florida and getting the guy who owns a jet ski company to take all these kids out on jet skis, and getting the guys who do scuba diving and snorkeling to teach them how to snorkel or scuba dive. And kids got to do things they never would get to do. And so Kyle called me and said, "Brian, we started another camp in Tennessee. It's almost all kids on the autism spectrum." He said, "Something tells me you need to be there. I don't know why. I don't know anything except to say, you need to be there. Here are the dates." And I'm not taking no for an answer. So I went to St. Louis and became part of Camp Able there. And I just have a few quick photos to show you. This young guy on the left here, I think he was about 17 or 18 years old, totally nonverbal. I don't know if he understands language, but I know that he can't use it. And one of the counselors had a guitar, and he kept looking at the guitar. And the counselor looked at him and said, "Do you want to play the guitar?" And his eyes got kind of big. So he took the guitar, and I think it looked like it was the first time this young guy had ever touched a guitar. And so he started strumming it. And so then the counselor started putting his hand on the neck to play the chords. And I didn't time it, but I would say it was around 2 hours that the counselor didn't have anything else to do except to be there for this kid, to let this kid's curiosity about this guitar be indulged as long as he wanted. This is another counselor on the right with a camper named Calvin. And Calvin was the opposite. He was super verbal, never stopped talking on the autism spectrum. And Calvin loved World War II. and he knew about every battle, and he memorized an unbelievable number of facts about World War II. It so happens that that counselor was in the academy to become an officer in the Army. So the two of them would go around and set up checkpoints and ask for everybody's papers to get by. And what basically happened is a counselor played Army with a camper for a week. We were sitting at the table one day, and Calvin said to me, "Brian, do you know about the Battle of the Bismarck?" And I said, "I've heard of it, but I don't know anything about it." And Calvin said to his counselor, "Private, go get me a paper and pencil." And so for the next hour, I got a lecture on the Battle of the Bismarck, almost moment by moment detail. I watched this counselor with this young guy also who is nonverbal, who has autism also. And they were going on a zip line. Any of you have seen a zip line? And his counselor said, "Do you want to go?" And this kid can understand language, and he shook his head and he looked very excited. They got him all set to go. And his counselor said, "Are you ready?" He got really scared. He says, "No." So they unhooked him, and he just went and watched a few more kids go. His counselor said, "Do you want to go now?" I counted 6 times. They got him all suited up, and 6 times he got afraid. And nobody got mad at him. There was just patience. There was no other agenda than if he needed to be afraid, he could be afraid. If he wanted to get vested up and then be afraid, he could. And then after the 6th time, the 7th time, he and his counselor went down together. And when they got to the bottom, his eyes were big. And she said, "You want to do that again?" And he said yes, and they were up. And so for the rest of the day, it was going down the zip line. This was probably the most challenging kid who was there. He is what's called a runner. And if he comes into a room, he'll run to one side and touch the wall, run to the other side, touch another wall, and he'll just keep going back and forth and back and forth. He loves 2 things more than life. He loves Venetian blinds, and he loves dryer hoses. You know, those sort of metal expandable dryer hoses. And when he arrived, he ran and was looking for Venetian blinds, and he pulled one set off the wall, and he was going for a second set when I happened to get this picture of his counselor helping him not tear the second set off the wall. She showed up the next day. She'd gone to Walmart and bought several sets of Venetian blinds so that he could have a fresh set each day. Another day, the same kid, he ran, and his counselor goes chasing after him. And when he comes back, he's got, do you all remember Yellow Pages? Like, I don't think I've had a set of Yellow Pages for years. He found a set of Yellow Pages in the office of the retreat center. And I didn't want to make a scene, but I just discreetly took this picture, because what he did is he took that set of Yellow Pages, found a trash can on wheels, pulled it over to the table, and took up about 4 or 5 pages, ripped them out, crumpled them up, threw them away. And he kept tearing pages out of the Yellow Pages until the entire book was turned into a trash can full of paper. I don't know why he got pleasure out of that, but it was very clear he did. And his counselor just went and stood behind him, rubbing his back the whole time, because this was a week where people said, probably he gets in trouble when he tears books apart back home. But here's a place where we can let it happen. This is one last picture I happened to snap. Do y'all remember that Taylor Swift song, "Haters gonna hate, 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 players gonna play, 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 play"? Well, somebody had a boombox and that song was playing. His counselor was sitting next to him, and I just happened to overhear, and she's singing, "Venetian blinds, 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 blinds. Dryer hoses, 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 hoses." And he looks up at her with this look like, "You get me. You understand. what I love. And what I realized at the end of that week is I had been, in a sense, I saw people, these young counselors, almost all of them, maybe between 18 and 24 years old. I think that week I saw the longest sustained demonstration of love I'd ever seen in my life. And what I realized is all of these counselors were just normal teenagers, and somebody invited them into a community where the agenda of the community was to learn how to love, and to learn how to love people who are often rejected or marginalized. And it just struck me how simple it was. They were invited. They were exposed to more experienced counselors. When you come as a first-year counselor, you're just an assistant. You gain experience yourself through that week. You build relationships with the campers and with the other counselors. At the end of every day, this Episcopal priest would bring when the kids went home, he would bring, because this was just a day camp. Some of them are sleepover camps. This was just a day camp, but he'd bring all the counselors together, and some of these kids have no religious background. These counselors have no religious commitment, but he'd say to them, "Where did you see God today?" And every one of the counselors knew how to answer that question, because God wasn't an idea in their heads. God was what they were experiencing in their interaction of love with the campers and with the other counselors. And each year when they'd come back as a volunteer, they'd take on more challenging campers. And many of them went on to get training and ended up working in special ed. And at the end of every week, it was one of the most raucous, outrageous, fun celebrations at the end of the week you'll ever experience. And then, of course, at the end of the week, they all say, "We'll see you next year." And I just thought to myself from that experience, what might it mean if our churches, instead of becoming marketing and defense centers of beliefs, actually became schools of love, studios of love that taught people to follow a curriculum of Love 101, learning to love your neighbor, and then a stranger, and then an outcast or outsider, and then an enemy. Love 201, learning to love yourself in not a selfish way, but not a self-hating way, to truly learn to love yourself. Love 301, to learn to love the earth and all creation, because our neighbors and ourselves, we're all a part of the earth, and we're connected to the earth, and every breath we take, the oxygen in one lung comes from the rainforest, and the oxygen in the other lung comes from the phytoplankton in the ocean. To learn to love the earth and all creation, for neighbors and self, for God's sake. And in the process of learning to love neighbor, self, and the earth, we would learn how to love God. Before we break, I just want to read one little passage from the book, and then we'll go to our break. Sorry, I'm just needing to change my view here so I can see this. When we love our neighbor, ourselves, the earth, we will not find it hard to learn to love God, because God will not be for them a doctrine or theory separate from or inconsistent with what they already love. Rather, in their experience of love for neighbor, self, and creation, they will already have experienced God. Because as Richard Rohr says, God is an event of communion. They will already have come, as the Quakers say, to love and reverence that of God in every one. So in Love 401, people learn to recognize and love the familiar light they see radiant in everything they already love. They learn to inhabit God as the loving reality in which they live and move and have their being, the all-encompassing event of communion in which they have experienced countless events of communion. Each experience of love itself, they will realize, has been an experience of God, for as John said in the New Testament, love is from God. Everyone who loves is born of God and knows God, for God is love. And so we think of that love as one big, beautiful reality, one experience of expanding in a life of love, spiraling upward to love in greater ways. So what we're going to do in just a minute is break into groups of 4, and we'll put these questions in the chat. And there'll be a personal question. First, we talked about a spiritual migration from system of belief to way of life. If you were to describe your life as a spiritual migration, what would you say you're migrating from and towards? And encourage each of you to just offer a short, quick, honest answer to that. And if you'd rather pass, you can just say pass. Then, if you have time, go on to the second question. Theological question. The Apostle Paul said in Galatians, the only thing that matters is faith expressing itself in love. Put that statement in your own words in a variety of ways. Try not to use the words, the only thing that matters, faith or love. So really try to find your own words. And then if you have time, a practical question. We spoke of the love cycle, 4 loves integrated into one. Maybe you can articulate those 4 loves in your own words and talk about what kind of lifestyle would flow from those 4 words. So let me turn it over to Dan now, and he'll send us to those groups. Before we jump into the second 2 migrations I want to talk about, I wanted to say that Lumunos, having roots in the work of Sam Shoemaker back in the 20th century, when Sam Shoemaker, an Episcopal priest, played a role in the design of the 12 steps. When they made a decision to speak of God, but not require people to follow, to all agree to the same beliefs about God. And in a certain sense, they gave people permission to be at different places in their understanding of God. You can see what Sam was doing was creating a way to loosen up on dogma, to focus on saving people's lives, which is certainly a deep act of love, and something I am eternally grateful for, the witness and work of Sam Shoemaker for really taking us into a new place. And I shared that story of Camp Able, but in many ways, I've had similar experiences, and I bet many of you have too, in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous or Chemical Dependence Anonymous or another recovery group, where there was an atmosphere of love that was created. And in some ways, learning to work the 12 steps was a kind of curriculum to help people move in the direction of love. So I just wanted to make that connection. So if love is the point, let's talk about where that takes us next. There's a very significant theological migration that is being hotly debated, even as we speak. And I would describe it like this: a migration from understanding God as a violent supreme being to understanding God through the lens of the nonviolent Holy Spirit, the Spirit of Jesus Christ. Now, this is a huge subject, and all I'm going to do is mention it here. I think many of you are already signed up to be part of a book study on Great Spiritual Migration, and others of you will be invited to be part of a book study. This section of the book, I think, is super important, but there's one special line of thought in the book that I thought was really worth bringing up today, being the day that's traditionally been used to celebrate Columbus Day. We all know in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, but a lot of people don't know in 1452, Pope Nicholas told European Christians what to do. In 1452, Pope Nicholas sent out a letter. The first letter went to King Alfonso of Portugal, and then subsequent letters went to the King of France and of Italy, and Spain. But here is what that first letter said. I have to tell you, I feel horrible even reading this, but this is the words of the leader of the Christian religion in the West between 1452 and 54 in a series of documents. He said to the kings of Europe, invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens. Saracens were Muslims and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ, wheresoever placed, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate to himself and his successors the kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert them to his and their use and profit. Now, if you've never heard those words, don't be embarrassed. I never heard these words until I was in my 50s. But it comes from a series of doctrines that are collectively known as the Doctrine of Discovery. And it was the permission slip for colonization. I think this is one of the most significant documents in human history, but it's largely been kept a secret. So in 1452, when the Pope gave the European nations permission to make slaves of all other nations, that set the stage for Columbus when he came to the Dominican, what we would call Dominica, and he met the Taino people. Well, again, I hesitate to read this. It just turns my stomach. But in 1495, he wrote a letter back to the king and queen of Portugal. And here's what he wrote. I'm sorry, back to Spain, the king and queen of Spain. He said, it is possible with the name of the Holy Trinity to sell all the slaves which it is possible to sell. Here there are so many of these slaves. Although they are living things, they are good as gold. This is the guy that has been, who a day is set aside to celebrate him. There's much more to the story that we don't have time to talk about. I tell some of the story in the book. But the hundreds, thousands of the indigenous people of the Caribbean were made slaves, and they were forced to work on plantations in the Caribbean. And I won't read this; it's just too horrific. But 40 years later, there were very few people who spoke out that this was wrong, because to speak out meant you were speaking out against what Pope Nicholas had said back in the 1450s. But there was one, his name was Bartolome De Las Casas. And here's what he wrote in about 40 years later. We can estimate very surely and truthfully that in the 40 years that have passed, with the infernal actions of the Christians, there have been unjustly slain more than 12 million men, women, and children. In truth, I believe, without trying to deceive myself, that the number of slain is more like 15 million. And of course, a lot of people don't know that the first enslavement was of native peoples. Before Charleston, South Carolina became a place of importing African slaves, it was a city for the export of Native American slaves, because Native Americans were enslaved before they then began importing African Americans in the Atlantic slave trade. No wonder a Native American scholar named Wazia Talon, First Nations scholar from Canada, said Christians have so much negative history and dogma to overcome within their own tradition. I do not believe the religion is even salvageable. The planet will not survive another 500 years of Christian domination. And this is the reflection of people who've paid attention to the facts, and seen what a violent understanding of God did for millions of Christians over the last 500 years, in a real sense, because people had an idea that God was violent and that God didn't have a problem killing and torturing people, that God was willing to kill millions of people. And they could find Bible verses to quote to defend this. It, in a sense, put what I would call a Christian genocide card in people's back pocket. And when you hear debates going on today about Christian nationalism, just understand that this brutal, vicious, ugly, unconscionable history is being suppressed. I live in Florida, and our governor has done everything he can to keep schools from being able to tell this part of our history. It's as if many of our political leaders are trying to keep a secret, both about our country and about the role that the Christian religion, and I say this as a committed Christian, but that I've had to face that our Christian religion has played. And of course, in large part, we did this because of the way we read the Bible. And so part of this second migration is to say, if love is the point, then we have to go back and scrutinize our ways of interpreting the Bible and applying the Bible. And we have to make sure that we disarm the Bible so that it will never be used to justify this kind of slaughter and enslavement again. Again, this is something that I cover in much more detail in the book. And if you're just being exposed to this for the first time and it's very disturbing, I understand. It was disturbing to me too when I first started learning about this. And if you'd like to ask questions about it in a few minutes, that would be just fine. In fact, I hope you will. So first migration is a migration toward love. A second migration says we better. Could everyone be sure to get to have your microphones turned off, please? That would help. And the second migration builds upon it to say, how are we using the Bible and our understanding of God to justify being unloving toward other people and the earth and so on? And that brings us to a third migration. If love is the point, and if God is nonviolent and loving toward all creation and all people, no exceptions, then that leads to what I call a missional migration, where we move from organized religion organized for its own self-protection, and we move to religion organizing for the common good. And again, there's so much that I go into in the book in a lot more detail, but the big idea here is that when people are upset with religion and they say, I want to be spiritual but not religious, I think what they mean is they're upset with institutional religion. And some of them say, well, I'm against institutions. But the fact is, if you want there to be hospitals, hospitals are institutions. If you want there to be schools, schools are institutions. If you want there to be police and courts and entertainment, all of these involve institutions. And so if you want there to be spirituality, there are going to be institutions that promote and defend spirituality. But your concern is legitimate, because very often institutions stop working for their mission and they start working to just preserve the well-being of their staff or the well-being of their members, and they forget about any purpose for the institution. Now, one of the ways that you can think of institutions is that institutions live in a dance with movements. You can think of it like this. Movements make challenges to institutions to say, you've got to do better. Institutions almost always say, hey, I'm trying to maintain all the old advances that movements have made, and just keeping things going is not easy. So there's always this dynamic tension between movements and institutions. When movements succeed, they inject new values into institutions. When institutions reject movements, movements very often have to start their own institution. And guess what? Go fast forward 40 or 50 years, and that new movement will be struggling to maintain, and people will come and challenge it and say, you've got to do better. That's the challenge of institutions and movements. And part of what I think is happening in the Christian faith, and I think similar things are happening in other faiths, I know they are because I'm in touch with many of the people engaged in this, is that many of us who are Christians are trying to find out how to rekindle Christian faith as a movement, not just as institutions. Now you say, well, what is a movement? A movement's born when three things happen. Two or more people agree what's wrong, they agree what should be done, and they begin to do it. Some years ago, I came across a book, and I actually got to know a guy named Greg Leffel. He wrote a book called Faith-Seeking Action, Mission and Social Movements. And what Greg did is he did a thorough study of social movements and came up with 6 characteristics of vibrant social movements. And I won't go into the whole backstory of this, but I was in Africa when I met Greg, and he shared with me these 6 characteristics of vibrant social movements. And on my flight home, I actually had a old-fashioned in-print version of the Bible, and I took Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. I opened a Bible, and I had these 6, and I just started looking through the Gospels. And what hit me as never before is that I know this isn't in any of the creeds, but it's undeniably true. Jesus was a movement leader, and he was building a movement. And what often happens is we keep the institution going, but we forget about the movement. And rather than explain theoretically what these 6 are, I'll just share with you what I discovered from my own study on that long plane ride home from Africa. And then this thought has continued since then. An opportunity structure basically says this: movements can't succeed unless elites are conflicted. When elites are in control, nothing changes. It takes destabilization, often conflicts between elites, for a movement to have the chance to be born. Well, in Jesus' day, the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Herodians and the Zealots were elites who were conflicted with one another. And all of those elites were in conflict with the struggling masses in Galilee. In fact, whenever you read in the Gospels about Galilee as opposed to Judea, you could think of it this way: Judea is where the elites lived, and Galilee is where the struggling masses lived. And when you just have that insight and you read the Gospels, Jesus looks like, you just realize he is working in the midst of an opportunity structure. Rhetorical framing is, how does a movement name itself? How does it summarize its message? So if I say the civil rights movement and Dr. King, you all remember the phrase, "I have a dream." That was brilliant rhetorical framing. And so Jesus provides rhetorical framing. He talks about the kingdom of God, the commonwealth of God, life to the full, life of the ages. His word salvation, which actually means liberation. And he provides rhetorical framing at mass gatherings on a hillside. We call it the Sermon on the Mount. In houses that are so crowded, people are standing outside the windows to listen. He takes his disciples away on special retreats to go deeper with them. He has public debates. He uses parables. He uses rituals and practices, and creates this dynamic tension with the tradition where he in one way affirms it and in another way challenges it. Brilliant rhetorical framing. His protest or messaging strategy, this is, how do you get attention for your message? How do you draw people in? You start reading the Gospels and you think healings and miracles are kind of public demonstrations. Teach-ins like the Sermon on the Mount bring people in for free education, which was a big deal for poor people in those days. Civil disobedience, turning over the tables in the temple, guerrilla theater, exorcisms. I wish we had time to talk about this. Festivals where he feeds people, like big festivals where a lot of people are fed. He names evil and names heroes, blessings and woes. Brilliant messaging strategy. A mobilization strategy. How do you build more leaders for the movement so the movement can grow? And Jesus does this. He has 3 in an inner circle, 12 in another inner circle, 70 in another circle, and they reach out in turn to the multitudes. He gives a huge amount of responsibility to his followers and has great confidence that they'll even do greater things than he'll do. That's what he actually said. Then he creates a movement culture. There's a certain vibe of his movement. It had this feeling of love and joy and justice and risk and hope and creativity, courage, service, willingness to suffer, but nonviolence all the way through. This was the culture of the movement that Jesus created. And then finally, the 6th of these characteristics is when people participate in a movement, they have stories to tell about how their lives were changed by being involved. So people who are involved in the civil rights movement, they might tell you the story of how they were there on the Selma Bridge when the dogs were unleashed on them, or when, or in other civil rights demonstrations when they took out fire hoses and shot people with water. People who were who've been part of protests in the Black Lives Matter movement, or in protection of the environmental movement, people who have worked with Bill McKibben. I've been on protests involved with Bill McKibben and his work. They have stories to tell about how their lives were changed by getting involved in activism. And so Jesus takes his disciples, he gives them challenges, he takes them away for a rest, they go on retreats, he encourages them, they make mistakes, and then he helps them pick the pieces up after the mistake. And of course, in many ways, what we have in the New Testament is the residue of changed lives. And so it might make us ask, what kind of spiritual movement is trying to be born among us today? What movements always make demands and proposals? What are the changes that this spiritual movement is demanding and proposing to people today? And how could you and I, if this warms our heart, actually play a part in the emergence of this kind of movement? A movement of spirit-empowered people who are committed to regenerating love in the way of Jesus, to save the planet, to join in solidarity with the poor, for work for peace among all people, no exceptions, to the glory of God. And thank God there are so many people who are Catholic, Protestant, Pentecostal, just in the Christian faith. And then in other faith traditions, there are amazing people doing good work in this area too. And in a sense, what would it mean, instead of asking, are you part of a Christian institution, to think, I'm actually becoming part of a vital Christian movement working for the common good. And that is a flavor of the kind of changes that I see, 3 of the changes that I see going on in our world today. So I'll stop there and we'll bring in Doug for some conversation. And I don't know, Dan, if you have any other instructions.
I would only ask, there were some great questions coming in, so keep them coming in. And Doug, I will turn the floor over to you to have a chat with Brian.
Thank you, Brian. It's really provocative in all the good ways. I think a lot of the questions that I saw and that I have is, so now what? What do we do? And one of the ones that struck me that came in that I find particularly troubling, and a lot of us do, is Christian nationalism, where where they don't necessarily have any interest in engaging with us. And so whether it's that or the crisis in our democracy as people of this movement, what do we do? Where do we start?
Yeah. Well, obviously, Doug, I know you think about this a lot, and I certainly do too. And something is becoming clearer to me over the last several years. And this might be one of the first times I try to put it into words. So let me see if I can put it into words. The first thing that was clear to me several years ago is that when people try to do bad things, if you just let them get away with it, in a certain sense, you're complicit. If you're just silent and you just let it happen. And so the word for that is resistance, that we need resistance. We need people to say, this shouldn't be happening, and I'm not going to just be silent and let it happen. I got experience in this regard. Many of you will remember in August of 2017, there was the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, and I was asked to be down there as part of a clergy counter witness. And I'll never forget that that weekend. I never thought in my life that I would see people carrying Nazi flags and chanting Nazi slogans in my lifetime in the United States. I just never guessed that. And the violence, I mean, and then of course we saw a repeat of it on January 6th. And now we're watching all kinds of people minimize it and excuse it. And in one way or another, try to pretend it didn't happen or that it doesn't matter, and all kinds of conspiracy theories and all the rest. So I do think that people have to resist. Sometimes that means getting in the streets. Sometimes, very often what it means, though, is finding ways to differ graciously with people in our own lives. And my term for this is the courage to differ graciously. It means your father, your grandfather, your Uncle Joe says some racist statement, and you don't just let it slide, but you don't call him a name and tell him you hate him and you'll never speak to him again, because then you're just adding to the division and hate. What I recommend we learn how to do is to say, Uncle Joe, I see that very differently. You know, Aunt Mary, I've heard you say that before. I just need you to know, I don't see it that way. I see it very differently. I'm defining myself, not them. I'm not saying you're a bigot or you're an idiot. I see that differently. And then almost always they'll ask, well, what do you mean you see that differently? And if it's in a public setting, what I try to do is I try to say, I don't need to go into it right now in public, but if you'd like to ask me in private, I'll be happy to explain to you why I see it differently. Because if you say it in public, it's going to be an argument, two egos defending their ground. And that just tends to make people become even more angry. But when people go in private, conversations can happen. So there's a lot more we could say about that, but that's the work of resistance. But I feel that the work of resistance is not enough. And I think about what Richard Rohr says again and again and again, which is the best critique of the bad is the practice of the better. And what I think this is going to mean is that more and more of us are going to have to start saying, we have to do resistance, but that's not enough. And then we have to add to the resistance creative alternatives. So for those of us who are Protestant and Catholic, it's the same. We tend to think that because the churches function as institutions, that we have to wait for a pope or a bishop or a presbytery or a conference to change policies, and that's what will bring change in the church. I think that I'm all for that, but I don't think that we have time to wait. Those might take tens and hundreds of years. I think what we have to do is remember Jesus' words, where 2 or 3 of you are gathered in my name, I'm there in the midst. And isn't it interesting that in movement theory, they always say, A movement begins when 2 or 3 people get together, acknowledge there's a problem, come up with an idea of what to do about it, and decide to do it together. And I think groups of 2 or 3 of us, and they can grow bigger than that, that's fine, but groups or 2 or 3 of us have to get together and do something. So I don't know, Doug, that was a really long answer, but my point is, I think there's resistance, and then there are creative alternatives. And those, and I think we have some people who don't do either, but I think I think all of us can move into both of those realms.
Yeah, and I think as Dan mentioned earlier, part of our role in the big picture Lumunos is to help people discern a calling. And we, like Luther and others, define calling holistically about the whole of your life. So for I'll just make this up, for the young parent who's got 2 kids and is working and is concerned about all these issues, and maybe just personally, because you're engaged on so many fronts and see so much need, how do you discern where to give your energies, and how should we do that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank God for the work you're doing in helping people go through that discernment process. The first thing I'd say is nobody can do everything all at once. In fact, I'm reading a philosophy book right now that makes a really interesting point. This philosopher says the essence of freedom is having the ability to decide where you invest your time and energy. Really interesting, and especially when you think of slavery. In slavery, you don't have much ability to choose how you want to invest your time and energy. Mm-hmm. So to me, we start by realizing that we have choices in how we invest our time and energy, and that's our freedom. And then to say, where do I feel moved, called, led, compelled? There'd be a lot of different words we could use. Where does something in me say, I only have X number of hours I can give a week, but here's the 1 or 2 areas where I feel it's mine to do. This is my work to do. And then we look for ways to get involved. And one of the things we have to do is, like in spiritual communities, what I wish we could do is, instead of putting pressure on everybody to be involved in the same issues, to say, your heart and your calling is going to lead you in one direction, mine might lead me in different, but we can encourage one another. I want to be glad and celebrate the work you're doing. I want to encourage you when you're discouraged. You do the same for me. And then I think we have the sense, like that image in the New Testament, one of us is a hand, one of us is a foot, one of us is an ear. We don't all have to do the same thing, but we all are working for the common good.
Yeah.
And I'll just add one thing about this, because you mentioned young parents, and those of us who are older know that the most demanding period of time for most people is when you have young children. So when my wife and I had young children, I'm not proud of this. I wish it weren't true, but I never went to a school board meeting. I never even thought about it. But now that I'm a grandfather, I've been going to school board meetings because I have the time, and I care about public education, and I care about my children. And where I live, we have some real, I don't know what you want to call them, but some scary people who are trying to take control of our public schools. And I realized I have the freedom now. I can go do that. And so, it's something you might have thought I should have done this, 40 years ago, but now's the time. And I feel super motivated about it.
Well, yeah. And I think it fits with, again, what we were saying earlier is that raising children is a calling. And so that is equally valid as being on the front lines of something. And so to wait until some space has opened up in your life to do that makes sense. This is maybe this is not fair, but I want to turn one of your questions over to you about your own spiritual migration, and not so much looking back, but I'm just curious. In our group, we found ourselves sort of curious about where our spiritual migration was heading. And I wonder if you have a sense of that for you, of what's out there on the frontier in terms of your own spiritual migration.
I would love to say something about that, Doug, but I'm really glad that you all are thinking about that. And it brings to mind, first of all, something that Thomas Merton said. I think he said this in the early 1960s, might have been the late 50s. But, you know, because it was quite a while ago, a lot of us forget that Thomas Merton was really a trailblazer. And for those who don't know, he was a Catholic, a Trappist monk who started writing. His first book, Seven Story Mountain, became a huge bestseller. And he, in many ways, was a pioneer at rediscovering the contemplative path and in integrating contemplation with social action, because he became very outspoken about war, nuclear war, Vietnam War, and civil rights. He wrote a book called Confessions of a Guilty Bystander. But Thomas Merton wrote this powerful prayer. I was just reading it again recently, where he said, "Lord, I don't know where I'm going." In other words, he had this sense, like if you were to say, "Where are you going spiritually?" He's like, "I don't know. I feel like I'm going into unexplored territory. I know I'm leaving something. I'm not sure what I'm going toward." And the reason I bring that up is because I have felt that a lot in recent years. It was way more clear what I was migrating from than to, but that's part of the exploratory progress. But if I were to say one issue where I feel my migration is leading me to, I feel like we in the Christian faith have this big problem with the word God, G-O-D, because when we say God, many of us have definitions that go along with that word that I think are highly problematic, including that God is violent, including that God chooses people and rejects other people, including that God has favorites and disfavorites. And there is so much baggage with the word God that I'm really interested. Part of where my migration is leading me is to say, instead of just being ambiguous or walking around on eggshells, let's have some really open discussions about what that word God really should mean. And I don't mean arguments in a stupid, egotistical, my opinion versus your opinion, but let's have some intelligent, honest, humble conversation about our ideas about God. I'm excited about that. Yeah.
Well, actually, there was a question about, Lumunos. One of the things we love about this organization is that we're rooted in this Christian tradition, but we have a lot of friends, and a lot of our programs are with our quote unquote secular, right? So we have just a lot of people that are non-religious, or maybe they're from other religions. And where do you see them in this movement, this migration?
So important. That's such a good, important question. Can I just say, see, this is another brilliant thing about Sam Shoemaker. And the work he was doing, decades and decades ago, he was imagining spaces where people didn't have to all agree on dogma. In fact, this is a bit of a tangent, but if you were to take the 12 steps and just say, what are you required to believe to be part of this movement? You basically have to believe that you're in trouble and you need some help, and you don't have the power to do it on your own. You need some other people, and you need some power greater than yourself. And that's pretty basic. But part of what's happening, in fact, some of you may know that my most recent book is called Do I Stay Christian? Because a whole lot of people are just saying, I'm done. There's been one scandal too many. There's been, I'm just done. And so I think for the foreseeable future, those of us who are in religious communities and those who have left religious communities, and some who've been out of religious communities for generations, we've got to look at each other and say, what kind of future do we want? And it's going to take all of us working together. And this is something, with what's been going on in Ukraine, with Ukraine and Russia, we've had discussion, and Korea, North Korea, we've had that word nuclear war come back into our consciousness in recent weeks in a way that, some of us, I grew up with where the Cold War and the threat of nuclear war was part of my childhood. And some of you are old enough to remember that. But the fact is, at times like this, Christians can't solve all the world's problems. Muslims can't solve. It's going to take religious people can't solve the world's problems. We've all got to work together and understand our collaboration. And in that spirit, I think, brings people together. And we make room for each other, and we welcome each other to the table.
Is that a movement? Is it possible to have institutions that can bring religious and non-religious people together, or is that more a movement?
Well, I think both can. So, for example, I'm a product of public education and a state university system. Two of the most important institutions in my life, who formed me to be who I am today, had people of all different religious settings. And movements can do the same thing. So one of my favorite images is a picture in the civil rights movement, of Martin Luther King with Rabbi Abram Heschel walking right beside him, a Christian and a Jew walking side by side in the civil rights movement. And a picture it's not on my desk right at the moment, but I've had on my desk for many years. I can't even remember. I gave it to somebody or something, but it was a picture of Thomas Merton and Thich Nhat Hanh when they met when they were both young men. And to me, seeing their friendship that began with letters, old-fashioned paper and pen letters, and then they met in person. It's just this reminder that, our friendships are important, our relationships are important, and working together is really important.
Yeah, and many of us have loved that Book of Joy with Desmond Tutu and the Dalai Lama. It's another example. The power of that conversation. So looking at my Zoom screen, we have a number of wonderful elders with us, and you're getting up there. You said, like, any word to elders and where they fit in this migration, this movement?
I think first of all, Doug, just the fact that you're using that word it's a great word for people once they reach a certain age. I don't know if it's a age that's a number or an age that's stage of life. But here's when I knew it was happening to me. I'm not proud of this, but I'm just being honest. When I raised my children, I love my children and I did my very, very best for them. But raising my children felt like part of my life's work. So in a certain sense, even though it was about them, it was still about me, When my children had children, it was very interesting because I'm so aware that they're going to live most of their lives without me. And when I became concerned about their well-being and about the well-being of my children now as parents, it's just so interesting. I just felt, without trying to, I just felt like my importance started to diminish in my own mind, and the importance of my children and grandchildren, it's all about them, And I think when we start to feel it's not all about me, it's about future generations, I think that's when we're moving into that eldering phase. And so I guess a couple things I'd say is, if you're coming into that phase, there's some great books out there. This might be something that Lumunos could do to help people. And I'm thinking of this wonderful thing that Bill McKibben, I know you all did a gathering with Bill McKibben, and Bill started something called Third Act to try to help people entering this stage of life to figure out how to make their lives count. Because what all too often people just, I know this because I live in Florida in a retirement heavy area. People get old and selfish and crotchety and judgmental. Very different. That's not an elder. That's just an old person. But when you get to the place where you say, whatever wisdom I have, whatever years I have, whatever money I have, this is about future generations. That, to me, is it's a beautiful gift.
Yeah. I'm just going to push a little more on that, because I know so many people who are saying, yes, I want to use Marge Percy's phrase, I want to be of use. I want to do that, but society or culture doesn't want me.
Yes. Yeah.
It's really encouraging to hear about McKibben's Third Act, that there's a movement, a structure or something for people who feel like they still have something to give. But as you know, it's such a youth-oriented culture.
Yeah. I just feel like that problem is one that we should that should be one of our takeaways from this evening. What can we do to help those people who have something that they want to give? And in a way, it's finding their calling, finding the way that they can give what's in them to give. And like, two things popped into my mind right away. Do y'all remember that movie? Oh gosh, what was it called? It was with Jack Nicholson, and he starts supporting an orphan. Does anybody remember the movie I'm thinking of?
Is it about Schmidt?
About Schmidt, yeah. Which was just this sort of, in a way, it felt like that was a movie trying to grapple with this this struggle. And then what comes to mind is this thing I've heard about people doing that I haven't done, but I'm kind of inspired to figure out when and how I can do it. But where grandparents are writing letters to their grandchildren to just try to pass on some of their wisdom. To say that one of the gifts they want to give to their children are the gift of some of their life wisdom in writing. And part of writing a letter like this is also saying the beauty that they see in their grandchildren, and to specifically be namers of the beauty and the gifts that they see in their grandchildren. I just think to myself, wow, that's one that's inspired me that I have not yet done, but I want to do.
Yeah, I can imagine that. And there's some great ideas that are coming in on the chat for resources and books.
Oh yeah, Jen Chittister's Gift of Years. What a great book that is. There's another one called, in fact, there's one by Rabbi Zalman Schachter Salome. Is that how you say his name? That is what is it, From Aging to Saging or something like that?
Yeah. And I'm it feels, I can imagine if you're a grandparent, that desire to do what you're saying, that's just a natural inclination. To me, it's even bigger and more inspiring when I see elders who are engaging in some of these issues of beyond just their own family. I mean, that feels really important. Yes. We're just about out of time. There was a question here, a light question here from David Cubbage. In your book, Do I Stay Christian? You speak of the you as a different concept for God. Do we need a different name, or could we just claim the quote God of Jesus?
Yeah, can I just say, I saw that question, and then there was another question about the Bible. And on both of these, what I would say to people is we're going to need a lot of solutions. I don't think there's going to be a one-size-fits-all solution on this, at least not in the short run. I think different people are going to have different ways of dealing with this. So, for example, I'm not saying I'm for this or against it. This is just an observation. But I have a lot of friends who don't say the word God anymore, but they do say the divine. Or they don't say, I prayed to God. They say, I held it up to the universe. And I can see what they're trying to do. They're saying the old language just doesn't work for me anymore. They're trying to find new language. I had an experience some years ago. My neighbor where I used to live was a Reconstructionist Jew, and she invited me quite often to go to synagogue with her and her family, which I didn't always do. I did many times, and it was a super meaningful blessing that she brought me and inviting me. And I noticed that in Reconstructionist Judaism, they have like dozens of names for God. They intentionally multiply names for God. So they'll speak of the holy, the source of life, the giver of wisdom. And I think that's an area we should explore. And with the Bible, I saw one of the questions, there is so much violence in the Bible that what some people want to do then is to say, well, let's edit the Bible and get those violent parts out, or let's throw the whole thing out because it's inescapably violent. I think what we need is a grown-up way of interpreting the Bible. And the good news is incredible work has been done on this already. I talk about it in Great Spiritual Migration and in several of my other books. But what it's going to mean is we just have to have a different starting point when we talk about the Bible and how we use it, that takes this danger of violence, divinely sanctioned violence, seriously. And there are ways through it. Yeah.
Brian, thank you so much. You've been generous with your time, with your voice. We are fortunate to have you as a friend of Lumunos, and just thank you for the work you're doing. And thank you for following your call and doing what you do in a way that is both prophetic and pastoral. So thank you. For those of you on this call, and if you're interested in doing a deeper dive into Brian's book that his material tonight was taken from, there's so much in it. Our staff bought the book and read it in preparation for this, and there's just a lot there. So we're going to be doing a 4-session book study on his book, and you can go to our website at luminos.org and sign up. You'll see we're charging money. We're charging $40. Half of that money is going to go to an organization that the group chooses that reflects some of the priorities in the book. So not exactly Patagonia, but we're wanting to be generous with any fees that we collect for that. And then I'll just draw your attention to one other new event that Lumunos is doing. We're doing a Poet of the Month drop-in group. And, you know, in some ways, I think this conversation about language, part of the reason we're doing that is that poetry has a way of slowing us down. It's poets are masters at using words and metaphors. So our first one was last month that we focused on David Whyte. This next month, this month is Ada Limon, who's the 22 Poet Laureate. The point of these are not to talk from the head, but we kind of thought an alternate title for this gathering would be Poetry for Non-English Majors, which would exclude you, Brian, because I think you were an English major. But you know, the idea is not to have a head conversation about poetry, but to have something that provides language that can invite us into our lives a little deeper. We're always adding new events to the calendar, so we hope you'll check us out. If you're not getting our e-newsletter, you can sign up for that on the website, and that'll let you know what's coming up in the future. But thanks so much for joining us. And again, thank you, Brian. Great to be with you again. Take care, everyone.